Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last few videos, we've been talking about inhibition and what was F.M. Alexander's understanding of inhibition and how you interpret how he wrote about inhibition in his books. So, can you talk a little bit about how you and we use inhibition in a lesson of conscious guidance and control, and how this might differ from how inhibition is used in the modern Alexander technique?
Yes, it's important to relate the concept with how we use it in practice, because in Alexander's books, he talks about inhibition everywhere. In the four books, there are passages about inhibition, and the impression that you get is an impression of I don't know, imprecision, or an impression that every time he talks about inhibition, it's a different kind of inhibition he's talking about, or as if inhibition is a very amorphous concept. It's quite strange. So sometimes it's better to discuss inhibition as we analyze process in practice. So to remind you of this notion of process that Alexander used, I've taken the same picture of one sentence of his book. I'm going to start with this, and it's something we have already seen, where he says that he wanted to make clear that the success of any particular process must depend primarily on the general condition of psychophysical development and control present. Because a player with sensory appreciation is in any way at fault cannot satisfactorily carry out direction given to him. In this presentation, we see that the difficulty is the pupil is facing is a difficulty to carry out directions given to him. And so in the way I teach, we ask the pupil to carry out definite direction of performance, as well as definite direction or definite instructions of inhibition. And it's very important to see what we mean by that, and also to come back. I wanted to come back to what is meant by the general condition of psychophysical development and control present. So I have prepared a series of images with one of my students. So half of my students are teachers of the Alexander technique, of the modern Alexander technique, people that are teaching with their hands, people that are teaching the common Alexander technique. And half of them are not from that world. Half of them are from, well, more or less the business and music world. And so I wanted to show one student that is a teacher of the Alexander technique, and because I discovered when I finished my training that my condition or general condition of psychophysical development and control present was absolutely unsatisfactory. I had learned a certain way to conceive inhibition as stopping before thinking, stopping before acting, and then giving myself a series of directions. And so directions that were not to be carried out. So as the directions were not to be carried out, I discovered that during my training course, I was never taught how to satisfactorily carry out directions given to me, either by someone else or direction that I would give myself. And so I thought it was important to explain how many and how deep the differences are between the modern Alexander technique and the initial Alexander technique as I see it. So the second part is coming back to the very first book, coming back to superior tense in the first original edition. I'm showing a picture here that you will not find in the modern editions because this paragraph has been, well, saved from the new edition. I can't understand why. For me, it has been so helpful, so, you know, a form of direction that I've followed during my well, effort at trying to understand what Alexander was exactly exposing and what was his plan, especially because I wanted to understand how he could organize himself or readjust in the way he was when I was not after my training. So here he says, I may briefly explain orders concerning definite inhibition by stating that the teacher will have to deal with incorrect movements unconsciously performed. These movements, occurring at the moment when the teacher dictates the orders, the conscious guiding orders, necessary to bring about the coordination of the different parts of the mechanism, assert themselves and become primary, and they hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. Well, we have already seen that, that sentence some time ago, but it is so important to me that I wanted to come back to it and discuss incorrect movements unconsciously performed, and note that these movements that are unconsciously performed hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements that are ordered by the teacher. The teacher is ordering correct and coordinated movements. The only way the teacher can realize this task is to give verbal instruction to the pupil. So we are clearly discussing here the possibility to give orders to a person, and that person will use these orders of movement in order to anticipate his own reaction to a task. So the question is, why would a person anticipate his own reaction to a task? Well, it's obvious that the person must have been told in advance that his reaction to the task incorporate unconsciously perform movements that are hindering the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. So we are discussing here something very practical, and so I have taken an image from one of my lessons, a recent lessons, and so this lesson is given to a very senior Alexander teacher, well, a teacher of the modern Alexander technique, and I've hidden his identity. And so the situation here that you see is part of a lesson where the pupil is tested. We want to test the person to establish what is the general condition of psychophysical development and control present. That's the idea. And the pupil knows that this situation is taped. There is a video recording going on, and these images that I'm going to show here are just still images taken from the video. And the pupil, after each lesson, receives a video of the entirety of the session. And the person is going to look at the video and see how are his reactions without definite orders of performance and definite orders of inhibition. Because here, well, the definite order of performance is that I ask the person to place the indexes on the lowest ribs on the side of the torso. And we have already defined that there is a rib cage that on the side of the torso you can feel the abdomen, where there are no bones, but if you lift the index finger slightly, you will suddenly encounter bony ribs, and you can therefore locate where are the lowest one on the side of the torso. So I request the person to use the mechanism of the arm and place the index finger on the lowest ribs on the side of the torso, and tell also the person that is the idea is to take a step back to lean on the wall behind him. He absolutely knows there is the wall, he knows how far he is from the wall, and that is the condition of the test, the condition of the experiment. And at first, of course, there is very little conscious guidance and control present, as you will see, and the pupil needs to see how he reacts. The camera filming the session is very interesting to, in fact, show or present the series of movements that are resulting from this, task. The person has a task, a double task. He must touch the lowest ribs on the side of the torso with the indexes, and then he must take a step back to land on the wall. And so the first thing that we see here, that the pupil, as Alexander says, cannot carry out direction given to him, given a psychophysical development and given a condition of control present. Yes, that is, you would say, a reaction. And despite the fact that the teacher has been teaching to inhibit, stop before acting, and rehearsing neck free, head forward and up, back to lengthen and widen, knees forward and away during many, many years, as to himself and to other people, this is what we see. So, seeing this, when I was myself in the same condition, I suddenly realized that my training with STAT had not given me the means whereby, to change the general condition of psychophysical development and control present. Yeah. So when you read Alexander, just after saying that you're going to see incorrect subconscious movement, or here you will see the continuation of that sentence that I present. It's again the first edition of Man's Supreme Inheritance. It's page 197. That's what he says. It is therefore as necessary to order the inhibition of incorrect and unconsciously performed acts as to give orders, conscious guiding orders, which will secure the coordinate use of the mechanism involved. And so when I read and started to analyze these sentences, for me this was really a blow. I started to realize that inhibition could be used as an intention to suppress acts. And the sentences are so close, it's one sentence after the other. On the sentence before, Alexander is talking of movements, and now he's talking about acts. So for me, I started to realize that he's using the two words as synonym. One time it's acts, the other the performed acts and the performed movements, one and the same thing. So I started to realize that I was not aware of the different movements that led to the position I was taking in standing and walking after my training. No more than my friend, the teacher that is having lesson with me, is capable of, in fact, inhibiting incorrect and unconsciously performed acts that are leading to a shortening of the torso, leading to a decreasing thoracic capacity. So, of course, when you discover that there is a lack, well, you cannot stay there. You cannot just, I don't know, stop teaching or continue teaching the same thing when you understand that you're not within the tracks. So that's why I started to imagine or invent a new way to give Alexander Technique lessons. That is, Alexander Technique lessons without hands that would be dedicated to help the pupil order the inhibition of incorrect and unconsciously performed acts, because that's what we are discussing here. We are not discussing the capacity of the teacher to perform something for the pupil. We are discussing the center stage is set on the pupil. We want the pupil to secure the coordinated use of the mechanism involved. It's not for the teacher to secure that coordinated use. Because the teacher is just an observer, it's just outside. Even if you manipulate someone, manipulating someone, a puppet, will never give that person the capacity to inhibit unconsciously performed actions or movements. That's what I discovered at that moment. Now, Alexander says we must not overlook the fact that in any attempt to gain for a pupil the desired control and the increased thoracic capacity, the pupil's incorrect use of the mechanism involved is an impeding factor. And so, in attempts to correct such imperfect use, the first consideration must be to prevent the psychophysical activities which are responsible for this defective use by the development and employment of the pupil's ability to inhibit. So we are clearly in an attempt to gain for the pupil the desired control. The pupil must have desired control of the movements that are organizing the torso to increase the thoracic capacity. This idea is not to give the pupil the correct coordination, the correct organization of the torso, if that could be done, and that's it. No. We want to gain the desired control for the pupil. Well, it's the pupil that must take control. And the incorrect use of the mechanism involved is an impeding factor. I had thought that after 3 years of training, I would be re-educated, or in the correct direction to be re-educated. I thought that after 3 years of training, 3 years of incessant hands-on procedures applied to me by senior teachers, and I saw many of them, and I thought that that would give me the desired control and the increased thoracic capacity. But as I've shown, I discovered that when I was reacting to situation, I had none of the desired control. The stop and inhibit, the stop and reason was not working, at least for me. And when I started giving lessons to other teachers, I started to notice that it was working for no one. Well, that I know of. I've never seen a teacher, despite all the marketing and the publicity about the fantastic result of the modern Alexander technique. When you ask a person and you test, you make a real test of coordination of the movements and reaction with increased thoracic capacity, with lengthening torso, you never see the control you expect. After spending so much money, having so many lessons, well, I was expecting to be much better at control and at the development of psychophysical acts. And so, when Alexander is discussing the prevention of psychophysical activities responsible for defective use, I was not satisfied, as you can imagine. And so the next part of the sentence, I am showing another picture of constructive conscious control, and it's quite an interesting one. It says this prevention of the psychophysical activities responsible for the defective use demand from the teacher a correct diagnosis of the pupil's numerous bad habits in connection with the act of respiration in everyday life, and a comprehensive understanding of the imperfection in sensory appreciation, conception, adjustment, and coordination, which are manifested in these bad habits. I wanted to show you that sentence because I was afraid that in my last interview with Kevin, I've given the impression that everything, in fact, stood on this capacity to change the sensory appreciation. Alexander teachers, after their long training, are supposed to have been re-educated. They're supposed to have a sensory capacity to know what is right for themselves, but also for their pupil, and to know with feeling how to perform a process. Well, if you think this, you must think again, because here Alexander is clearly, of course, presenting the scene from the teacher point of view. But as I wanted to give the control to the pupil, I started to realize that the pupil must be aware, must be made aware of the correct diagnosis. What do we mean by correct diagnosis of the pupil's numerous bad habits in connection with the act of breathing, expanding the torso? And I realized that I had very little understanding of what made me shorten the back, of what made me protrude the abdomen or contract the neck region. And so I thought, well, the correct diagnosis must be shared with the pupil, and the comprehensive understanding of the imperfection must not be just for the teacher. When I teach, when I give lessons to my students, I want them to develop that comprehensive understanding of the imperfections. And this comprehensive understanding of the imperfection does not stop with this problem of sensory appreciation. There is also the conception of the movement, of the process. What it is to, I asked the person to place the hands on the side of the rib cage. Well, this seems very simple, yet it is going to be obvious very quickly that using the mechanism of the arm in order to touch the side of the torso implies forcibly the organization of the movement of the different parts of the torso. We will see that just asking a person to place the fingers on the side of the torso realize a test of the capacity to direct the movement of the shoulder relatively to the torso. Not only the conception, but the adjustment. If the muscle around the shoulders have been tight for many years without the person noticing, despite his training in sensory appreciation, it's absolutely obvious very often that there are serious restriction of movements. So if you ask the person to place the fingers to touch a certain part, you will find that the person has a reaction that is adapted to his coordination and to the adjustments that are the most often repeated in these parts. And last, not least, the imperfection in coordination. The bad habits that we see are, well, like a symptom, a manifestation of imperfection in coordination. And when we say coordination like this in the air, well, this is really broad, a term that is not really defined, but if you say coordination of movements, coordination in the acts, you remember acts and movements are synonym, and so coordination of acts. So let's go and first of all explain this idea of testing and diagnosing. What is a diagnosis, a correct diagnosis? Well, I will show you first that it's the same image as the previous one. It's just that I'm starting to show what is seen, what we can infer from the position. So the finger, the index finger, is landing, yes, on the lowest ribs on the side of the torso spot. There is one rib, the 10th rib, that is really easily to locate. Yeah. And what I see is that, well, there is a protruding abdomen. It's not difficult to see that. There is the upper torso is pulled back at the top. You see that the sternum line, if you set a line on both extremities, the upper extremity and lower extremity of the sternum, you will find that the person is pulling the neck back relatively to the abdomen. Yes, you will find, of course, that the person is collapsing the torso and the abductors of the legs are absolutely released, useless. And so there is a sharp bend at the back. So the person is, well, shortening the back, pulling the shoulders up, yeah, and all that because there is two ideas, because the person has not started yet taking the step back. The person is preparing to take the step back. I have a bit complicated the test because instead of just asking the person to step back, I said, could you touch the lowest ribs on the side of the torso? And this has a tendency to produce a certain adjustment of the mechanism of the arm relatively to the mechanism of the torso. And this, of course, is, leading to that position in, Alexander talks about position in standing and walking. So this is exactly the case. We have a position in standing and walking. The person is thinking of walking backward, and this is the position we can see. But in fact, for the pupil, this is just like a judgment. Like it's okay to have this, but it's not sufficient to have a diagnosis. A correct diagnosis is not just showing that the person has a tendency to shorten the torso and reduce of course, the thoracic capacity in everyday acts. With that, you can just, when I started to discover this with myself, I was really distraught. Well, it's not a real positive analysis for the moment. The diagnosis is not positive. It's difficult to work with this, and you just say, wow, I've been directing the neck to be free, the head forward and up, and the back to lengthen and widen all my life, and now that's where I am. This is not constructive. So for the diagnosis to become constructive, you need another step. It's the step where you're starting to analyze the kinesthesia. By kinesthesia, I mean the different movements that are necessary in order to produce that standing and walking position of the torso. So here is much more interesting. We see that in order to obtain that position, in standing and walking backward, the pupil is coordinating some movements. Of course, these are unconscious. They are not movements that the person has decided to make. No, he just wanted to reach the goal, which was to take the finger to the side of the rib cage and start walking backward. But the person is subconsciously ordering a series of movements. We see that there is a series of movements where the lower rib cage is projected forward. Yes, forward, off. Of course, I've got a little sign. It's a spot on the elbow. Maybe you can see it, maybe not. I just asked the person to realize that we can direct the movement of the parts from the moment we understand that these physical parts have, striking anatomical landmarks that we can have in mind. And in this case, I can quickly explain to the pupil that the person apparently is forced to adjust the elbows backward and the lowest ribs forward. When the middle torso is going forward relatively to the mechanism of the arm, it is indeed going forward relatively to the upper torso. Therefore, we have a rotation of the ribcage object, and that rotation is, of course, conducing to a shortening of the back, as much as there is also a rotation of the pelvic object in the other part of the torso. And we can see that these two rotations are, in fact, creating everything we don't want to see. The imperfection in coordination is made clear to the pupil. We must state exactly what we are working with, what we want the pupil to work with. We are not just saying you're pulling down. I am saying, well, this representation, this description that we can make at the moment must go and expand itself toward the explanation of the movements that are necessary to produce it. This is the means whereby principle. The teacher has to explain which means are used in order to obtain a certain position. The position is obviously imperfect, incorrect, but it's necessary to explain which movements are in fact coordinated in order to obtain such a position. Without that knowledge, it's going to be impossible for the pupil to gain control. If you cannot control something you know nothing about. If you think that your back is arched, I've heard so many times people saying, I have got a problem with my spine, I've always had that problem, I have a kyphosis, I have lordosis, I have such and such, I have a scoliosis, I have a protruding abdomen like my father or something like that. I very clearly refuse this explanation. I refuse this explanation because they are not helpful in the sense that they are not producing for the pupil that capacity of control, that capacity of understanding. And Alexander talks about comprehensive understanding. The imperfection in sensory appreciation, of course, is blatant. It's obvious that the person does not feel what he is doing, because if he would certainly not do that. He would certainly do something else. The conception of the movement of taking a step back is clearly incorrect. Yeah. It's absolutely obvious that to take a step back, the person is preparing to move the lower torso backward, arching the back. It's certainly not what we want, yes. And the person has no idea of the adjustment possible. The person has no idea that there is a limitation at the moment in the mechanism of the shoulder, that the person can only bring the hands to the side by pulling the elbow back, meaning that there are certain groups of muscle at the back that are very, very short. They are leading to a shortening of the back, and so this is clear. Makes it clear, because we have an Alexander teacher, a person that is a specialist of sensory appreciation, makes it clear that the supposed advantage of getting a reeducation of sensory appreciation is non-existent. Well, at least for me, that's where I stand when I see a reaction that is shown like this. But this is not sufficient for the pupil to understand what we mean by inhibiting. You cannot ask the person to stop collapsing the pelvis, rotating the pelvis forward at the front. You cannot ask the person to stop rotating the rib cage. The person has no way to take control of this. So it's necessary to go one step further. Diagnosis is fine, but you need also to teach. You need also to say to the person, well, now that we have elicited, we have diagnosed or described which are the movements that are coordinated together in order to promote that type of position of the torso in standing and walking. Now it's necessary to start and look at what could happen. So I'm starting with the just 2 spots, and I say to the person, could it be possible for you to inhibit pulling the elbow backward, yes, when you want to move backward? Would it be possible to inhibit pulling the elbow backward when you want to lift the hand toward the side of the torso? And it's necessary for the person to realize that, yes, it is. And that the video is going to record what is happening. And not only can I ask the person to inhibit the wrong adjustment, I can easily talk about a better adjustment where the lowest ribs on the side of the torso are moving back and the tip of the elbow is moving forward. Remember, we are discussing a reaction faced with a task. And so the readjustment is not a readjustment of position. It's absolutely obvious, and it must be made obvious for the pupil. Despite his tendency to think always in position, it's my duty, and the type of work I'm doing is to remind the pupil that he needs to readjust movements. He needs to think about movements. What you see here, this readjustment, looks like a readjustment of position. It is not. It is a readjustment of movements. And it can only be obtained if the pupil is starting to control the movements, not the position, or not the feeling that this position is creating for him. We don't care what sort of feeling he has, we just want to see whether the readjustment of movements is creating a new, breathing capacity. And for the moment, it is seen that yes, the tightening at the back of the lower rib cage will absolutely change, because now we can see that when the lower rib cage is going back and the upper rib cage is going forward, there is a fullness, there is a widening, and I can ask the pupil to, use a simple experiment to see that yes, it's possible to really discover that the movements that we are discussing, which are a movement of the middle torso opposed to a movement of the mechanism of the arm, tend to produce a widening of the lower rib cage, a widening of the back. And so the pupil is going to continue, and so when the pupil is giving these correct orders, that's where I wanted to come, we are going to see something that is very interesting to read, is that the pupil is starting to use correct indication of movements. The directions of movement that are given to the pupil are creating something much more interesting. Yes, these are correct movements, but then we see that when the person is starting to implement a better readjustment of the two movements of the elbows and lowest ribs, suddenly we see something is that the shoulder is rising very much. You see? If you look at the shoulder is much lower, is somewhat lower than the chin, same height, but as the pupil is readjusting, you will see that the pupil has a tendency, in order to comply with the instruction that are correct instruction of adjustment of movement, we see that the pupil is starting to lift the shoulders. So that is the interesting point that Alexander is making. Now that the pupil knows what are, the correct directions of movement that he should coordinate together, we see a subconscious, unwanted movement appearing. We see that the person is widening the back, yes, the upper back is widening. You will make the experiments yourself, and you will see that when the lowest ribs are going back relatively to the arm, then yes, the middle torso is widening. Yes, but it's absolutely obvious that, well, the shoulders are going up, that the person is restricting the front of the chest, and that the person is pulling the head down. It's impossible not to see it. So this is going to be the second phase in the session of conscious guidance. We are going to start thinking that could be very interesting to continue the same process, because very often when people start a process and they suddenly discover that, for example, there is a tightening at the face or tightening at the neck, or the head is going down, suddenly they say, oh no, this movement must be bad. It must be bad to direct the movement of the lower rib cage backward because the student is pulling down. One action, one reaction, stop. Well, in fact, the technique is a bit more comprehensive. You must understand that, yes, when the person is going to perform a correct series of movements, the teacher is, well, of course, watching whether these movements are going in the right direction. We don't want perfection. We just want to see if the person is going in the right direction. That's all. And we must tell the person when he's going in the right direction. So the person now in the organization of the mechanism of the arm relatively to the torso is going into the right direction, that we call supporting the torso with the arms. Well, it's something that comes from constructive conscious control of the individual, where Alexander explains hands on the back of a chair. This is not hands on the back of a chair. This is hands on the side of the rib cage. But it's more or less the same idea. And so now we have the exact condition of the lesson described by Alexander. The person understands which are the correct movements. The person is more or less capable of performing these directions of definite performance, which are leading to an expansion of the torso. Yeah, but there is an unwanted consequence. When there is an unwanted consequence, we are very interested. The idea is then suddenly in the lesson to have a new tack, a new direction of work, where we want to have the pupil understand that the correct movements are correctly performed. That's fine. The person has two intentions of movement and is capable of directing the two intentions of movement, despite the fact that when you start with a back like this, an habit of reacting like this, and you come to something like this, you must understand that the tissues are not used to play in this way. They are most of the time out of action here. There is a constant release of the back here, you know, well, release of the back, let me explain. Of course, the muscle may be tight, but the fascia, the thoracolumbar fascia, the most important spring in the back, is here, well, completely released, completely, well, it's now not stretched. There is no stretch between the lower torso and the middle torso, as you can see, and you have a slack spring. A slack spring does not produce any force, any usable force. So that person is unaware that he's misusing the most important spring in the organism. He is unaware that there is a strong force that could help him to maintain the torso and lift the leg to the torso in order to take the step back in perfect security, in perfect poise. You must understand that there is no poise in this image. The center of support is at the ankle, and if you see, you will discover that the person is leaning forward very far and must make an enormous effort, well, to just maintain the posture, yeah? So the pull at the neck is immense. It's a pull that is necessary for a postural reason, for not falling forward. When the middle torso is so far forward of the center rotation, gravity, you know, does not lie. The person is falling forward. So in order not to fall forward, the person is arching back. So Of course, when the person is starting to direct these movements, there is a very strong feeling going on with it, of stretch, of tension, and so it's not easy for an Alexander teacher that all his life has thought that it was about releasing. Well, the person is not feeling release for the moment. But we are interested in what's happening with the direction of the upper spine. We see that for the moment, the direction of the upper spine has no support yet. We can understand it. It's just a new use. The person has never lengthened the back in walking backward ever, and so it's quite new. So we are going to start another experiment. And it's absolutely necessary for the pupil to have a graphic understanding of his habitual reaction. So we see the same person, much closer to the wall, but this time I'm asking the person to use a strap, an elastic tissue that is placed about on the middle lumbar region and held by the hand. The first advantage is that I want the person to be exactly clear about what shape the back is in his habitual reaction. Often, it's difficult to really imagine when you are giving lesson every day, but many people, they do not imagine how the torso is beneath the clothes. I'm not asking the student to disrobe, but sometimes it's necessary for the person to have a clear idea of what we are discussing. We are discussing a movement of the lower rib cage going backward. Back means that we want the lower rib cage to be directed backward relatively to the mechanism of the arm. This person has been used all his life to wear his arms backward relatively to the front of the rib cage. Yeah. Suddenly we want the opposite coordination of movements. The adjustment is going to result with this idea of having the elbow forward and down and having the lowest ribs back and up. So we oppose, and the person, I show these pictures to my student. I want my student to have a clear idea of the direction of movement applied to anatomical landmarks. So I want the pupil to have this, and I want the pupil to see what it is I see. I see the sacrum plate and the lumbar region going in opposite directions and marking an absolute shortening of the lower back, a protruding abdomen. I want the pupil to know that, and I want also the pupil to realize that we want so that at the moment we are playing with the wall procedure invented by Delsart, and used by Alexander, and we see that the person is directing the lowest ribs in order to pull against the elastic band. I discovered that sometimes with people that have been working with what they feel all their life, well, I can make use of what they feel. They can feel when they are stretching the fabric of the elastic band. They realize that, yes, they can move their ribs back. They can move their ribs back and they can change the rotation of the rib cage. When they change the rotation of the pelvis simultaneously, suddenly we get a lengthening of the back and the head is projected far forward. And now you are going to see it's still visible that the head is down, but the shoulders movement is now following the direction. The person is starting to be able to perform the instructions given to him because these instructions are explicit. It's very clear that we want the palm, the base of the palm spot that you can see here, that is the junction between the palm and the forearm, and we want that spot to be lifted at the height of the shoulder while the elbows are maintained directed downwards. The movement of the elbow is very important because we want to see whether the person could comply with directions where the mechanism of the arm is going forward, where the lower rib cage is going back without lifting the shoulders. So the person has in view a very simple geometrical system where you have a sort of a triangle. the lower end of the triangle being the tip of the elbow. And if the elbow is going up, or if the hands is going down, it's going to be possible to indicate to the pupil that the direction of movement is incorrect. And using that system, we can evaluate whether the new conditions are going to provide more support for the upper rib cage and provide a better support for the cervical spine. The upper thoracic spine is going to be supported, and the next step is to support the upper spine, which is the cervical spine, in order to continue to have the head forward and upward. Because of course it could be very easy to lift the chin and pull the head back. We are not interested. We are interested to fulfill a model where the head is forward and up, where the neck is free of tension, and where the back is lengthening and widening. So this is what the pupil is starting. So you see, in between these two images, we see that the pupil is now more capable of directing the base of the palm at the height of the shoulder while directing the elbows down. And in this simple movement, there is a slight start of a movement of the head upward while keeping the direction forward. And so for a person that has had a habit of kyphosis, of collapsing the upper torso forward and down, well, this is a great indication that we are discussing a functional problem. It's the way the person uses the parts that leads to the incapacity to maintain the head forward and up and to maintain an upper torso open. So the expansion of the thoracic capacity is not just at the lower back. It's also at the very top and front of the torso. So where is inhibition? Well, in these two images, you see that we are asking the person to inhibit dropping the hands. At first, the coordination of movement and the adjustment of the movement is such that as soon as you ask the person to, in fact, use the mechanism of the rib cage against the mechanism of the arm, you will find systematically that either the shoulders are going up or the hands are going down. On this picture, you are starting to see a new coordination where the hands are going up and the shoulder not. I need to teach all the students how to lift the hands in the air without lifting the shoulders. Strange, isn't it, for someone that has been using the hands all his life to discover that he was not taught. He cannot be taken, put responsible for something he's not been taught. He's never been taught to inhibit the movement of lifting the shoulders when lifting the hands. Now, this is part of a comprehensive understanding. It's not just inhibiting one movement. It's inhibiting directions of movement that are incorrect in the sense that they do not produce a general adjustment where the neck is free, the head is going forward, and the back is lengthening and widening. So this, again, is a presentation. I could go, very far because we have not discussed how to support the torso with the legs. This is only supporting the torso with the arms. You must understand that there is as much difficulty and comprehensive understanding to be gained on how to support the torso with the legs. At the moment, of course, the pupil is using the wall, as you can see. And there are difficulty coming with it. We see that the upper torso is too far back, but it's a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction of understanding, and it's a step in the right direction of applying that understanding to a very practical action. Walking backward is not something out of this world. It's something that you can practice at any age, being young or old, and you can discover a new form of control of the mind and control of the movements. inhibition is a very complex picture. You cannot separate inhibition from directions of movement, or at least in my way of teaching, I never separate the two. Any comment?
So a couple of things about using the elastic strap there. So the purpose is it's not so that they feel the stretch, it's more that so that they understand what is happening, so that later they can do it. They understand the concept of the movements, so that later they can do it with their mind. Obviously, we're not telling people to go around with a strap to adjust themselves all the time, but it's useful as a tool to realize what's happening for some people.
Yes, I use tools, I use straps, I use rulers, and I try to discourage the students to use them in public. Because they are just tools, you know. You must not confound the tool and the control.
Yeah.
Of course, at first it may be necessary with somebody that has been using sensory appreciation all his life to, in fact, create conditions where the person starts to discover that, yes, he can direct movements, and directing movements in certain conditions, for example, when there is an elastic band, well, creates a tension in the elastic band. If the tension appears, it must be, yeah, sorry?
And it also can help them realize when something needs when a movement needs inhibited, they might not even realize, because they're not aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
And it gives them a sort of during the experiments they can learn this. Again, this is changing their understanding. It's not about the sensory experience of the stretch. It's about understanding what is happening with the movements.
Yeah.
And then obviously you can see more and understand more when you use the video after.
Yes, and also you're right. It's not feeling. You don't feel the stretch in the band. What you feel is that it's necessary to have two opposite directions of movement to stretch an elastic. You must understand that you can pull with the hands, but you have to pull with the back, and the direction of the pull have to be opposite. And it sounds ridiculous. It sounds simple, simplistic. Well, in fact, in practice, it is not. In fact, in practice, there are many objects that are springing to your attention, not the least what you feel. And so to remind yourself of the principles we are using, the principle of antagonistic action, the principle of stretch, the principle of bringing this tissue into play, is absolutely necessary for a person that has been thinking or believing for so many years that the technique was about release. And the person will see that immediately he allows release, then he loses the whole coordination.
And you definitely need to learn to inhibit your initial reaction to the bad feeling when it arrives, because otherwise you'll stop and you won't get anywhere. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jeando. So for everyone watching the video, if you'd like to book a lesson with Jeando and learn about inhibition, you can find a link underneath and his email address, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.